Good morning, gentlemen. This is a chapter 8 um, lecture for pages 345 to 357. This here is a portrait that we see at the very beginning of chapter 8. This is going to depict a reversal of roles. So, for instance, if there is a picture out there, and I don't have it with me, that shows kind of the clergy and the nobility riding on the back of the commoners. This is a reversal of the roles. On the right, you have the clergy. In the middle, there you can see the nobility and the commoners, which is the third estate. The reversal of class roles with the commoner riding on the back of the noblewoman and is shown in a dominant position over the nun, which is the clergy. So it shows kind of the female versions of this. The other one showed previously male, which represents the old world ideals, and now having the new world ideals that is coming out with this. So we're talking here about chapter 8, Atlantic revolutions and the global echoes that it exists with. Um, it opens up talking about the Haitian Revolution and the Haitian earthquake that devastated the country itself. It was already impoverished. There are heavy reparations that had to be paid to the French that really impeded the country for some time. It's not until after 21 years after independence that the French government demands $150 million in payment. And they finally repay those loans in 1947, does the Haitian government. But it's really a constraint on the government that existed at that time. But the Haitians are going to draw a lot of inspiration from the North American and the French revolutions within this time period. And so we start to take a look at what was the kind of new ideal that linked everyone together. So when we talk about the Atlantic revolutions here, and we look at them in a very global ideal, um, we have to understand from the early 18th to the mid 19th century, there's political and social upheaval that is taking place and occurring in many parts of the world. Um, that is a huge part of this. Atlantic revolutions are going to take place on a much wider framework that exists. But the Atlantic revolutions are very distinct in how they work. You have very costly wars that put strains on European states rather than, and it's global. This becomes a global action as opposed to regional. And those revolutions are going to be closely linked to one another. You'd have revolutionaries providing advice and encouragement to each other, and they would also share kind of a common set of ideas. The impact that we see from it, there's a huge impact that takes place because of this, and it's usually a global impact as well. The really what we're talking about, the Atlantic revolutions that we discuss are going to be the American or the North Atlantic Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Latin American Revolution. They also will spark other revolutions throughout time as well. Many people will draw from those ideals. Um, some of the things that we see that are born out of this immense global impact, it's seen in abolitionism, it's seen within the extension to the right to vote. We see it in constitutions that are made, greater equality for women. This idea of nationalism, okay, perhaps the most potent ideology from that is nurtured from this ideal, and the ideas of equality and what that means for this. We'll see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948, echoing and amplifying the principles that were provided in a lot of these constitutions and declarations that are a part of this too. So all those things become a huge aspect to it. When we compare the Atlantic revolutions, we're going to first take a look at North American Revolution, which takes place from 1775 to 1787. We consider it in the Americas very much 1776 because that's when the Declaration of Independence comes out. But really, these things have been brewing for quite some time, even before 1776 and even 1775. Excuse me. We all learn as a child about the American Revolution, this independence from this tyrannical British rule that was there. And all that launches us into the Declaration of Independence. Those ideals are all well known. Eventually, we win victory in 1781, and then we generate a federal constitution in 1787. And it joins all of our states together. Those things are things that we know, all right? And those are the rocks of what it is. But there are questions. What has changed? Is this a genuine revolution? And what does it change? Those are the big questions that we looked at. So, for instance, when we talk about this, and when we look at the big facts, the American Revolution itself is a conservative political movement. What does it do? It aims to preserve the colonial liberties rather than gain any new ones. When we talk about that, what do we mean? Yes, we wanted to split with Britain in those ideals. That is imperative for us to understand. We want the split with Great Britain. However, we don't want the split to create a new semblance of government. We just want to return to the ones that we had prior to the 7 Years' War, or as it's known in North America, the French and Indian War. We had our own rights. We had very much a self-governing nation, although I put nation in quotes there because we weren't a nation at that time. And so this political movement that exists is not to necessarily break away and start a new government. It is to break away to continue what we had, the same political liberties. And so autonomy is something that was very much enjoyed. The British government has their own issues going on, and so we are able to kind of run the country as we see fit. Very, very few actually think of breaking away from Great Britain. Why? There are several reasons why we might not want to break away from Great Britain. Advantages of it, of having Great Britain by our side, there's protection from war, access to the British markets, confirmation of the settlers' identity as Englishmen. Those are parts that are big for us. And there's very few drawbacks to it. So the fact is that this is a new drive for control as a part of this. The differences in England and North American colonies. Number one, a colonial society was far more egalitarian, right, than European society. So when we talk about egalitarian, what does that mean? It really means equality. It comes to the point where the North American colonies want to have a little bit more equality within this. Yes, do we still have the wealthy class of gentlemen? Groups like the Adamses, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Hancocks? Absolutely. And they are going to remain in political prominence for a while. But there is more of an egalitarian portion of this. There isn't an entitled nobility that we are looking at as a part of it. So there's no legal distinctions that differentiate between clergy, aristocracy, and commoners. Yes, we still have to look at the fact that slavery is a part of this. It is one thing that we don't get away from. The slaves, we understand, are not necessarily going to be a part of that, but it is an idea in that we are trying to be more egalitarian, having equality be a big part of this. Britain's going to make a new drive to control the colonies to get more revenue from them in the 1760s. They need more money for their global war with France. So they impose new taxes on the colonies. a place that they had really kind of just left for quite some time. They really didn't care much about it. The colonists are not going to be a part of the British Parliament, which they felt that they deserved. They thought it was their rights as Englishmen. The British simply looked at them as colonies. That's all they were to them. And they had denied the colonists the rights of true Englishmen there. So when we look at this, again, we talk, as I said, the British appear to deny the colonists their true rights as Englishmen. They are not necessarily considered Englishmen. They're considered colonists. Even though some of them are just as wealthy as others who are in the English colonies, they aren't considered to be Englishmen. The British actually look to, look to the areas in the West Indies as being more profitable than the English colonies were. So what ends up happening? The colonial economic interests are challenged with this. And we see that happening in a lot of different areas. And then Britain is going to attack the established colonies tradition of this local autonomy. They're basically going to say, yeah, maybe this is how it was, but this is how it's going to be from now on. You are going to be submissive to the crown, So that is something that is a vitally important part of this. Their society itself, the North America, is revolutionary for their society that had already emerged, not for the revolution itself. So they aren't necessarily trying to create this new idea. They already have an idea of who they are. So there's no significant like social transformation that comes from independence with Great Britain. The revolution is really going to accelerate also the democratic tendencies that they had already established. It's not like this is something that is so new that they hadn't done this. We'd already established some semblance of a democratic ideal here. And political power is going to still remain within the hands of the elite. We just changed the verbiage on it. The elite are still the controlling portion of this. Many Americans, though, thought they are creating a new world order. That is the case. Some people are going to acclaim that the United States as the hope and model of the human race. And there's a declaration of right to revolution that inspires other colonies around the world as well that exists within this. Political power will remain, the U.S. Constitution is one of the first lasting efforts to put Enlightenment political ideals into practice, and it will inspire many people. Simón Bolívar in the 19th century with the Latin American movement, Ho Chi Minh in the 20th century with Vietnam, the Bill of Rights, checks and balances, separation of church and state. All those things are going to be first sustained within the Enlightenment and then pushed into power by the Americans and by the Americas. Okay, this slide here, the Union of the 13 British colonies in North America. It's shown over the past years of 1788 and how it kind of moves itself out. There are anti-colonial struggles, however. It's not just going to exist in one area. So there are anti-colonial struggles there. This is an engraving here that dates back to 1775. Depicts a club that's wielding a mob of Liberty men, forcing a Virginia loyalist to, to sign a document, probably endorsing the independence of the colonies there. So you could see the real push to gain those ideals in terms of where they were going with this. Okay, the French Revolution and how it becomes about. This is a fascinating kind of story in a lot of ways with the French Revolution itself. So when we look at it, thousands of French soldiers had actually fought for the Americas in the Revolution. And so they come back with this revolutionary fervor that exists. Thomas Jefferson is the ambassador to Paris, and he reports that France has been awoke by our revolution. And the French government, which had aided the American cause within this in an effort to undermine the British, is now teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Um, and so they're going to look to modernize their tax system. So how does this come about? Um, King Louis the 16th calls into question what is the Estates General, not calls into question, calls it into meaning. The Estates General to raise taxes. The Estates General is three estates that they have. They have three estates that exist in what was kind of the old regime. The first two estates are the clergy and the nobility. The third estate is the commoners. The first two estates, the clergy and the nobility, make up about 2% of the population in France. The third estate makes up about 98%. That includes everybody else. So when the body convenes in 1789, generally it is going to have to deal with new taxes that are going to be placed on the first and second estate. Both of those do not want to lose out in this. So they break off into their rooms. And in this time, the third estate organizes themselves as the National Assembly. And they claim sole authority to make laws for the country. A few weeks later, they come out and claim the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This declaration later becomes the preamble to the French Constitution in 1791. And those actions, although very much unprecedented and illegal in what was regards to the old regime, they launched what is known as the French Revolution. And they radicalized many of the participants within the new National Assembly. The French Revolution is very different than the American Revolution as far as the uprising goes. How so? Well, the American Revolution expressed tensions that had a distant power a part of it. What ends up happening is that the French insurrection is driven by conflicts within the French society itself. So members of the titled nobility have this prestigious and wealthy. They resent the monarch's effort to push new taxes upon them. The middle class resents the kind of aristocratic privileges that existed at this point in time. So the urban poor suffer from things like inflation and unemployment. Peasants are oppressed in every single way. In most parts, it's not some type of serfdom, but there is that emphasis of things that's taking place. They are asked to build roads and things like that for free. They pay taxes to not only the French government, but also to the local aristocrats there. And so there has to become a change. So the Enlightenment ideas gave people a language to kind of articulate the grievances that they had. The French Revolution is violent, very far-reaching, and very radical. It will end hereditary privilege, meaning just because your father was somebody does not mean you will be. It ends that privilege there. It abolishes slavery for a time. It takes the church and subjugates to government authority there, and eventually even wipes it out. And they will eventually kill the king and queen. They'll be executed in 1793 via the guillotine. And we have a period in French Revolution that's known as the Terror, killing tens of thousands of people who are regarded as enemies of the revolution itself. There are efforts to create a new society. So 1792 becomes year one. They no longer refer to it as 1792. They create their own calendar. At one point in time, I believe they have 10 days in their calendar, so people can't follow along with what Sunday would have been. So religion gets put out. The country briefly passes a law for universal male suffrage. France will be divided into 83 territorial departments. There's a massive army, about 800,000 men that are created to fight anybody who is threatening to them as neighbors. Gender roles. The French society does not create in this realm a new society. in terms of gender roles, excuse me. And women do participate in the revolution, but their efforts to kind of gain political rights will ultimately fail in the end. Um, there is a feeling of nationalism as well that pushes this thing, and it increases the revolutionary state ideals too. And so radicals really push the edge or the idea of new beginnings. And it spreads all throughout the conquest. Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799 will eventually seize power. And he preserves many of the moderate elements of the revolution because the revolution is kind of dying out, and Napoleon brings this about in many ways. And I'll come back to this picture here in a second. Sorry, let me go back. I wasn't done there. And so he keeps social equality, but gets rid of the liberty aspect. His forces will subdue a lot of Europe. They'll take over quite a bit of that land, imposes very many revolutionary practices within those conquered religions. And there's resentment of French domination, and it stimulates the national consciousness throughout Europe. This is the beheading of Maximilien Robespierre. He was one of the leaders of the revolution early on and a big part of the terror, and they will execute him at this altar. So thousands of French, we in looking at that, we see kind of the distinction. And here we can see this map. Anything that is in green is the French Empire, dark green. Anything that is in a light green, so the Austrian Empire there, Prussia, that is all part of groups who were allied with Napoleon. Anything in orange are states that are dependent on France. All right. And then any place that is in brown is at war with Napoleon at that time. So we see the changes that take place, and we'll talk a little bit more about Napoleon. Some people believe that the French Revolution dies with Napoleon when he comes to power. Others believe it carries on all the way throughout 1814 when he is no longer a part of this. So we'll talk a little bit more about how these things go about. Napoleon is credited with a lot of factors here. Eventually, he will be pushed off and exiled to the island of Elba that you see right down here by Rome. He comes back and actually takes power again for 100 days, and then they execute him, or excuse me, not execute him, but exile him again to another place in the middle of the Atlantic. And that kind of ends his realm, and he'll die there. So that is it for today. I will see you all on Friday.